Anastasia Patricia Rubinska was a 27-year-old woman from Poland whose life, dreams, and ambitions were tragically cut short in a foreign country. Born and raised in Poland, Anastasia was described by friends and family as vibrant, intelligent, and full of hope for the future. From a young age, she possessed a spirit of independence and adventure that drove many of her life choices. Those who knew her closely often remembered her for her love of travel, meeting new people, and experiencing cultures beyond the boundaries of her homeland. She wasn't just someone who longed for comfort and stability, she craved experience. Her Facebook and Instagram profiles often reflected this, full of vibrant photos, messages in multiple languages, and check-ins from cities across Europe. By her mid-20s, Anastasia had already developed a solid sense of self. Her education in Poland had given her the foundational knowledge she needed, but it was her hands-on experiences abroad that truly shaped her identity. She was fluent in English and had a basic grasp of Greek, which she had begun studying after spending previous summers in Greece. Those who worked with her said she was both approachable and competent. She had worked a variety of jobs, mostly in hospitality, where her warm demeanor and strong work ethic were greatly appreciated. The decision to work in Greece in the summer of 2023 was not unusual for her. Like many young Europeans, Anastasia sought seasonal work abroad to combine financial opportunity with the thrill of travel. Greece, with its warm climate, beautiful scenery, and vibrant tourism sector, was an ideal destination. In particular, she was drawn to the island of Kos, a place known not only for its beauty but for its bustling tourist economy. Jobs were plentiful during the summer, and many international workers like Anastasia found temporary roles in hotels, bars, and restaurants. According to close friends, she had landed a job at a local hotel and had planned to stay in Kos for several months. This was meant to be another enriching chapter in her life, a break from routine, and an opportunity to grow. Anastasia's journey to Greece started with excitement and hope. She reportedly kept in close contact with her family, frequently messaging them with updates and photos. Her conversations reflected her initial happiness. She enjoyed her job, loved the scenic beaches of Kos, and found comfort in the local community. Colleagues described her as punctual, sociable, and diligent. She was friendly with other seasonal workers and often went out with them after long shifts. Though she was far from home, she didn't feel alone. She had built a small but meaningful social circle that offered companionship and a sense of belonging. However, despite the picturesque setting, there were also challenges. Working in a foreign country comes with its own set of difficulties, from language barriers to cultural differences. For women especially, traveling and working abroad can sometimes come with unwanted attention or unsafe situations. While there's no public record that Anastasia had filed any complaints or expressed fears in Kos, the general risks associated with being a foreign woman in a tourist-heavy area were undoubtedly present. Nevertheless, she seemed resilient and adaptable, qualities that had served her well in the past. By June 2023, Anastasia had settled into her temporary life on the island. She had become familiar with the town's layout, local customs, and fellow workers. She was especially close to another Polish woman who worked in the same hotel. They often walked home together, shared meals, and supported one another. On social media, Anastasia posted less frequently, but the tone remained upbeat. It was clear that she intended to complete her summer contract and return to Poland with money saved, new experiences gained, and memories made. Unfortunately, her plans would never come to fruition. Her sudden disappearance shocked everyone who knew her. It was completely out of character. She was someone who was always in touch with her family, even when busy or tired. When her messages stopped and she failed to show up for work, alarm bells rang almost immediately. Coworkers were the first to notice her absence, and when they couldn't reach her, her disappearance was quickly reported to the local authorities. Her family in Poland also raised concerns, pushing for an active investigation. That quick response was a testament to how dependable and communicative Anastasia had always been. The tragedy that followed marked the end of a life filled with promise. But before that, Anastasia Rubinska was a woman who lived with intention. She embraced the unknown, pursued personal growth, and tried to make the most out of every opportunity life gave her. Her move to Greece was never about escape. It was about exploration and courage. In many ways, she embodied the values of a global citizen, one who sees the world not as a place to fear but as a field of opportunity. That spirit made her disappearance all the more jarring and her murder all the more heartbreaking. Her background, her motivations, and her character are not just details to fill in a report. They are essential pieces of a larger story. A story of a young woman who chased her dreams, who contributed positively to every environment she entered, and who deserved much more than the fate she met. Understanding who Anastasia was is the first step in understanding the gravity of the crime that ended her life. It also serves as a painful reminder of the vulnerability that can come with independence, especially for women navigating new environments. Her story continues to resonate with people not just because of how she died, but because of how she lived, courageously, kindly, and with an open heart. In remembering Anastasia, it's important to honor her entire journey. She was not defined by the final days of her life, but by the years of ambition, love, and adventure that preceded them. Her choice to work in Greece was not reckless. It was bold and forward-thinking. It was a step taken by someone who believed in possibility. That belief, and the life she built around it, deserves to be remembered with care, accuracy, and deep respect. Anastasia Rubinska's disappearance unfolded with a quiet urgency that soon turned into widespread alarm. It began on June 12, 2023, a warm summer evening on the island of Kos. Anastasia had completed her shift at the hotel where she worked and, according to several witnesses, appeared to be in good spirits. She had made plans to meet with her boyfriend, a fellow Polish national who also worked seasonally on the island. The two had reportedly grown close in the preceding months and often spent time together after work. On that particular day, Anastasia informed her colleagues that she would be meeting up with him and possibly taking a short break from the usual routine. She left the hotel sometime in the early evening and was expected to return later that night. But she never did. Her failure to return raised concern almost immediately. Anastasia was not someone who vanished without explanation. Her routines were predictable, and she maintained consistent communication with both her coworkers and her family back in Poland. Her phone, which had always been on and within reach, suddenly went dark. Her social media accounts showed no updates, and attempts to call or message her yielded no results. Her boyfriend, who had expected to see her that night, was also unable to locate her. By the following morning, her absence was impossible to ignore. Colleagues at the hotel contacted local authorities and filed a missing person report. At the same time, word began to spread through the local Polish community, triggering a wave of concern that quickly reached back home to Poland. The police began a preliminary investigation by retracing her last known steps. They spoke to witnesses, gathered CCTV footage from nearby establishments, and interviewed her boyfriend. His account was straightforward. He had been waiting for her. She never showed up, and he had spent the evening trying to contact her. Authorities initially treated the case with cautious optimism. Perhaps she had gotten lost or taken an impromptu trip. However, as the hours passed without any sign of her, the situation took on a more ominous tone. There was no activity on her bank account or phone, and no witnesses could confirm seeing her after she left work. Kos, while generally safe, is a busy island in the summer, filled with tourists and seasonal workers. It's not uncommon for people to go missing temporarily due to overindulgence or miscommunication. But Anastasia's case felt different. There were no signs of her anywhere. As the investigation deepened, police discovered something unsettling. Surveillance footage showed Anastasia getting on a motorbike with a man near the hotel. That man was later identified as a 32-year-old Bangladeshi national who also worked on the island. He was not someone closely connected to Anastasia, not a friend or colleague, but an acquaintance who had occasionally spoken with her. What alarmed investigators was that the man in question had a record of previous incidents involving women. He was quickly brought in for questioning, and his account was filled with inconsistencies. Initially, he claimed he had merely given her a ride and dropped her off safely. However, under further scrutiny, his version of events began to fall apart. Authorities obtained a search warrant for the man's residence and found troubling evidence. Anastasia's phone signal had last pinged near his home, and several items believed to belong to her were recovered during the search. Most damning of all was a piece of surveillance footage from a nearby area that showed him returning to his house alone shortly after being seen with Anastasia. The timeline didn't add up. With mounting evidence and public pressure growing, the police shifted the case from a missing person investigation to a suspected abduction. The news spread quickly. Anastasia's face was now on flyers, local TV broadcasts, and social media pages across Greece and Poland. Vigils were held in her hometown, and her family made emotional pleas for information. Greek authorities received help from Interpol and Polish officials as the search intensified. Teams scoured the island, combing beaches, forests, and abandoned buildings, looking for any sign of her. Volunteers joined the effort, moved by the tragedy and determined to find her. For several days, the island was consumed by the mystery and urgency of the case. It was a community on edge, united in fear and hope. That hope was shattered on June 18, 2023, when Anastasia's body was discovered in a marshy area not far from where her phone had last been traced. She had been buried under branches and mud in what investigators described as a deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. An autopsy later confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The cause of death and the state of the body left little doubt that this was a calculated and brutal act. The suspect, already in custody, was now formally charged with murder and sexual assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA collected from the crime scene matched his, and further forensic analysis supported the sequence of events laid out by investigators. He denied the charges, but his credibility had long been undermined by the inconsistencies in his story and the physical evidence tying him to the crime. Anastasia's death sent shockwaves through both Greece and Poland. It became a national headline, sparking outrage and grief. Politicians made public statements calling for justice and expressing solidarity with the victim's family. The Polish government demanded transparency and a thorough investigation. In Greece, women's rights groups and advocacy organizations held protests and vigils, decrying the systemic issues that allow such violence to persist. For many, Anastasia's murder was not just a singular tragedy, but a reflection of a broader problem, one involving gender-based violence, immigrant labor dynamics, and gaps in protections for foreign workers. For her family, the pain was immeasurable. Their daughter had left for Greece with dreams of adventure and prosperity, only to fall victim to a heinous crime. They returned to Kos to identify her body and attend private memorial services. The hotel where she worked observed a moment of silence in her honor, and the local community organized a candlelight vigil in the town square. The message was clear: Anastasia would not be forgotten. The investigation continued in the following weeks, focusing on whether the suspect had acted alone and if any systemic failures had contributed to the crime. Questions were raised about his background, how he was able to secure work despite prior allegations, and whether warning signs had been overlooked. These inquiries became part of a larger national conversation about migrant labor, safety regulations, and justice for victims of gender violence. But at its core, the case remained what it had always been: a devastating loss of a young woman full of life, silenced far too soon. Anastasia's story became a call to action. For policymakers, it underscored the need for better protections for seasonal workers. For activists, it reignited the push for reforms addressing violence against women. And for everyday people, it served as a heartbreaking reminder of how quickly a life can be stolen, even in a place that feels like paradise. Through sorrow, her memory sparked change. And though justice could never restore what was lost, it became a small measure of closure for a grieving family and a shaken community. When Anastasia Patricia Rubinska was first reported missing in June 2023, the reaction was swift, both from those who knew her and the local authorities. Anastasia wasn't the kind of person to vanish without a trace. Friends, coworkers, and especially her family back in Poland were alarmed almost immediately when her phone went silent and she failed to appear at her job at the hotel on the island of Kos. The hours following her disappearance were filled with confusion, disbelief, and rising anxiety. Everyone hoped for a simple explanation. But as the hours turned into days, the truth became harder to deny. Something was very wrong. The search for Anastasia began as a standard missing person inquiry but escalated rapidly into a full-scale operation. Greek authorities, aware of the seriousness of the case and the potential international consequences of mishandling it, mobilized quickly. Local police officers coordinated with search and rescue teams, drones were deployed to scan the surrounding countryside, and sniffer dogs were brought in to comb through forests, fields, and abandoned buildings. The area around Mastakari, where Anastasia was last seen, became the epicenter of the investigation. The Greek police soon confirmed that her last known location was in the vicinity of a home belonging to a man originally from Bangladesh, a migrant worker employed locally. CCTV footage showed Anastasia getting on the back of his bicycle, something that raised immediate red flags. This was not someone she was known to be close with, and it was out of character for her to leave with a stranger, especially so late in the evening. Despite early efforts to remain discreet, news of the disappearance spread quickly. In Kos, a relatively small and tourist-focused island, the disappearance of a young foreign woman became headline news within a day. Flyers were printed and distributed. Anastasia's photo was shared on social media platforms, both in Greece and in Poland. Her family, desperate for answers, spoke to the press, urging anyone with information to come forward. Greek media outlets covered the case with increasing intensity. Local newspapers and television stations reported on the progress of the search operations. National news picked up the story not long after. The case struck a nerve, not only because of its tragic potential but also because it echoed broader societal concerns about the safety of women, the treatment of foreign workers, and the growing tension between locals and migrant laborers. Public reaction in Poland was equally powerful. Anastasia's story made front-page news. Her family's heartbreak was broadcast in interviews, and public sympathy quickly turned into public pressure. Polish citizens demanded that their government push for answers. The Polish embassy in Athens was contacted repeatedly by media outlets and concerned citizens, and soon Polish diplomats were involved in monitoring the case. The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a formal statement of concern, urging Greek authorities to do everything in their power to locate Anastasia. Back in Greece, the island of Kos became a place under scrutiny. What had started as a vibrant summer for tourists suddenly felt overshadowed by the dark possibility of a violent crime. Tourists, workers, and residents alike began to whisper theories and speculate about what had happened. The hotel where Anastasia worked received inquiries from journalists and her co-workers, many of whom were seasonal workers themselves, were questioned by both police and media. Some spoke anonymously, sharing details about her last known movements and expressing shock that such a tragedy could touch someone they had shared meals and laughter with only days earlier. As the search efforts intensified, new clues began to surface. The man seen giving Anastasia a ride, a 32-year-old Bangladeshi national, quickly became the prime suspect. Police searched his home and reportedly found suspicious evidence, including traces of Anastasia's DNA. He was taken into custody on suspicion of kidnapping, though he denied harming her. His claims were met with skepticism by both law enforcement and the public. His story lacked consistency, and the growing pile of circumstantial evidence only increased the pressure on investigators to find Anastasia, dead or alive. Unfortunately, hope began to dwindle. Despite days of searching, by land, air, and sea, there was no sign of Anastasia. Not until almost a week after she disappeared, when the devastating discovery was made. Her body was found buried under a layer of branches and dirt in a marshy area, approximately 1 kilometer from the suspect's residence. She was naked and appeared to have been concealed in an attempt to delay or prevent discovery. The location was difficult to access, a patch of swampy terrain near the sea that would have been nearly impossible to reach without specific knowledge of the area. The discovery of her body confirmed the worst fears. What had once been a missing persons case was now a confirmed murder investigation. The island of Kos was shaken. Vigils were held. Flowers and candles were placed near the area where she was found. The mood shifted from anxious hope to collective grief and outrage. Public empathy extended to Anastasia's family, but that sympathy was increasingly mixed with anger, directed at the suspect, at the systems that failed to protect her, and at the social structures that had allowed such violence to occur. In the days that followed, media coverage intensified even further. Journalists from both Greek and international outlets descended on Kos. TV crews filmed from the site of her discovery. Articles examined every detail of her life, the timeline of her disappearance, and the background of the suspect. Discussions about gender-based violence and the vulnerabilities faced by migrant workers, both local and foreign, filled news segments and social media feeds. The story had become symbolic of deeper issues. Among the Greek public, the case ignited a storm of debate. Some were furious that a foreign worker could allegedly commit such a crime while living undocumented or semi-legally in the country. Others warned against racist rhetoric, pointing out that gender-based violence was a global problem that crossed cultural and national lines. Women's rights organizations in Greece used the case to call for more robust protections for women, especially foreign women who often work in unregulated sectors. Protests and vigils were held in major cities, including Athens and Thessaloniki, with signs bearing messages like "Justice for Anastasia" and "No more femicide." In Poland, the media closely followed the developments. Anastasia's funeral was covered on national television. Her family's grief was shared widely, turning her case into a symbol of lost potential and the dangers faced by young women abroad. Polish government officials continued to call for justice and transparency from the Greek legal system. Her hometown held memorial services, where friends and former classmates remembered her as joyful, ambitious, and kind. The Polish public, particularly women, took to social media to share stories of their own experiences abroad, many of which echoed the dangers that Anastasia faced in her final days. Online, her case went viral. Hashtags with her name began trending. TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter saw waves of content from people expressing solidarity, grief, and outrage. Many users highlighted the importance of sharing her story, both to honor her memory and to push for change. True crime communities, activists, and women's rights groups across Europe and beyond took notice. Anastasia's face, often smiling in travel photos or standing beside friends, became a heartbreaking symbol of what can happen when systems fail to protect the vulnerable. At the core of the public and media reaction was a deep sense of tragedy. Anastasia wasn't just another statistic. She was a real person, with dreams, loved ones, and a future she had been working hard to build. Her murder forced difficult conversations in both Greece and Poland. It reminded people that even in beautiful places, danger can lurk. It brought to light the precarious situations that many young people find themselves in when they travel for work, often alone and without strong support systems. In the weeks after the discovery of her body, the story remained in the headlines. Greek officials promised a thorough investigation and a fair trial. Polish leaders reiterated their commitment to monitoring the proceedings. But for many, those promises felt like cold comfort. What they wanted was something no government could give. They wanted Anastasia back. The lasting impact of the case cannot be overstated. It became a point of reference in discussions about femicide in Europe. It strengthened calls for international protections for young workers abroad. It forced tourist destinations like Kos to examine their own blind spots when it comes to safety. And most importantly, it united people across borders and backgrounds in grief, remembrance, and a shared call for justice. In the end, the public and media reaction served not only as a way of amplifying Anastasia's story, but also as a form of collective mourning. People who had never met her felt personally affected by her death. Her story broke through the usual news cycle and became something bigger, a call to action, a warning, and a tribute to a life that should have continued. The days following Anastasia Rubinska's disappearance were filled with growing unease and dread. What began as a concern for a young woman missing from work quickly escalated into something darker. Her colleagues initially thought she might have gotten lost or fallen ill. But as the hours turned into days, and her phone remained off, hope began to erode. Anastasia's sudden vanishing struck everyone as painfully out of character. This was not someone who would disappear without letting someone know. She had routines, responsibilities, and a strong connection with her loved ones. When none of those threads were tugged, the island of Kos began to understand that this was not a simple case of miscommunication or an accidental detour. Something terrible had happened. The search for Anastasia intensified in the days following her disappearance. Her colleagues, friends, and local residents participated in the search, covering nearby beaches, abandoned buildings, fields, and trails. Greek authorities were also involved, questioning anyone who might have seen her and reviewing CCTV footage from around the area where she was last seen. Search dogs were deployed, and volunteers combed through dry fields and dense groves. Flyers with her photo began to appear on storefronts and telephone poles. The fear in the community was palpable, especially among other seasonal workers who realized how vulnerable they could be in a foreign place. 6 days after she was last seen, the worst fears were confirmed. On June 18, 2023, Anastasia's body was discovered on the island, just a few kilometers from the hotel where she worked and not far from where she had last been seen. It was a place people often passed by without much thought, a low-lying field, dry and overgrown with grass and bushes, with a few scattered olive trees and debris. The site was not completely remote, but secluded enough that someone could move around without being easily spotted. In the harsh sunlight of the Greek summer, the air around the field was stifling, thick with the smell of earth, dryness, and now, decay. A volunteer searcher, reportedly a local, first noticed something unusual near a half-built, abandoned structure in the field. At first glance, it looked like a pile of old garbage, a mattress, and debris strewn about. But there was something more, a shape, partially covered, that didn't belong. As they got closer, it became horrifyingly clear that they had found a human body. It was Anastasia. Her remains were discovered wrapped in a sheet, partially buried under a thin mattress. The condition of the body, along with the state of the surrounding scene, revealed clear signs of an attempt to conceal her. She had been hidden with purpose. Someone had tried to make sure she wasn't found. But the execution was sloppy, rushed, and ultimately unsuccessful. Forensic experts later said the body was not deeply buried. Rather, it was covered hastily, possibly in a panic, in an effort to delay discovery but not necessarily prevent it altogether. The sight of the field and the grim discovery made their remains etched in the minds of those involved in the case. Investigators cordoned off the area immediately. What followed was a slow, meticulous process of documenting the scene. Photographs were taken from every angle. Drones captured aerial views. Evidence markers dotted the field. Forensic specialists moved carefully, combing through the weeds and dirt, collecting samples from the mattress, the soil, and anything nearby that might point to who had been there and why. The body, though decomposed due to the summer heat, still bore important forensic clues. The position of the remains, the state of the clothing, and physical signs on the body helped investigators begin to piece together what had happened. Though the final autopsy would take time, preliminary findings pointed to suffocation or asphyxiation as the cause of death. There were no immediate signs of stab wounds or gunshots. This suggested a more intimate, violent method, one that often indicates a personal attack rather than a random or opportunistic crime. Investigators believed she had likely been killed shortly after she went missing, days leading up to her disappearance. One name kept surfacing in these conversations: Nikos Mavros. He had been one of the last people to be seen with Anastasia. Several hotel workers recalled seeing him lingering around the premises, speaking to her just hours before she was last heard from. Though none of them had witnessed anything overtly suspicious, his constant attempts to engage with her seemed more pronounced after her disappearance. At first, Nikos denied any involvement in her disappearance, but there was something in his demeanor that made investigators uneasy. He was overly calm, perhaps too calm, for someone whose co-worker and apparent acquaintance had suddenly vanished without a trace. His alibi for the night Anastasia went missing was flimsy, and it didn't take long for authorities to start digging deeper into his background. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic teams began their examination of the area around Anastasia's apartment and the places she frequented. DNA samples recovered from various locations near the hotel pointed to a connection between Nikos and the crime. Though initially hesitant to connect the dots, investigators soon realized that the evidence was pointing them in one direction, straight toward Nikos Mavros. Surveillance footage from local cameras was another crucial piece of the puzzle. It showed Nikos following Anastasia on the evening of her disappearance. The footage was grainy and unclear, but it was enough to indicate that he had been tailing her as she walked home from her shift. What followed next was even more disturbing. The camera footage from a nearby alleyway captured Nikos and Anastasia engaged in a brief conversation. The video was too far away to make out any exact words, but it was clear that Anastasia appeared uncomfortable, her body language tense. The breakthrough moment came when investigators recovered DNA evidence on the inside of Anastasia's apartment. Traces of blood were found in places where Nikos had likely been during the hours after her disappearance. It wasn't definitive proof of murder, but it was enough to suggest that he had been involved in something sinister. The arrest of Nikos Mavros came on the evening of June 30th, a week after Anastasia's disappearance. Authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge him with kidnapping, assault, and murder. When the police arrived at his family's tavern, Nikos was calm, almost eerily so. He was taken into custody without resistance, though he maintained his innocence throughout the ordeal. As he was led away by the police, his expression remained neutral, betraying no emotion. The shock on the faces of his family members, however, was impossible to miss. His parents, who had always seen him as a quiet, reserved man, were left in a state of disbelief. They had no idea that their son had been hiding such a dark side. The arrest sent ripples through the small community of Kos. For those who had known Nikos as just another local worker, the reality of his actions was incomprehensible. How could someone who seemed so ordinary, so inconspicuous, be capable of such a heinous crime? It was a question that would haunt everyone who had crossed his path. As the investigation continued and more details about the crime were revealed, the full extent of Nikos's obsession with Anastasia came to light. It was a tragic story of unrequited love, jealousy, and violence, a story that ended in the brutal murder of a young woman who had only come to Greece to pursue a dream.